I'm Emma Lapansky, and I have had lots of opportunities to skip and watch other people skip, too. I've been watching him skip for a number of years and loving every minute of it. This morning, we're going to talk about the AFSC and what it looked like on the ground, what it was actually doing. And it's pretty exciting. It is vision. I'm going to talk a little bit about the elephant, part of the elephant that I saw. I've been working for almost 30 years on a collective biography, a collective set of interviews from people who worked for the AFSC and tried to make it work in their lives. They took it home and started a living co-op in Philadelphia in the 1940s, right at that moment on the AFSC's 30th birthday, when the world said, "You guys are okay," when the Nobel Peace Prize happened. On its 100th birthday, here's an opportunity to do it again, to sort of say, okay, we're okay, we can do this. I first discovered the AFSC when I was working for the National Council of Churches in Jackson, Mississippi in the 1960s. And since then, I've been able to figure out the AFSC has one wonderful quality among its millions of other wonderful qualities. It's everywhere. There's one of them, they're like Geico. There's one of them on your corner. They're everywhere. And they're doing all kinds of things in their private lives and in their public lives. Some people come in, stay 5 minutes, and take it with them someplace else. Some people come and stay a whole lifetime. But it is a wonderful energy in the world we live in. And I share the notion that this is a wonderful time to use the opportunity that our president and administration have given us to re-energize. We have this morning 3 panelists who have looked at places where Quakers and the AFSC has been, and looked at what happened in those places. Some of it wonderful, some of it struggle. And we have 3 fairly interesting people, pretty interesting people to talk about it. The first is Dr. Susan Armstrong Reid. She's an adjunct professor at the Department of History at the University of Guelph. Both her teaching and her research focus on the transformation of humanitarian work since 1945. Her 3rd book, The China Gadabouts, The New Frontiers of Humanitarian Nursing, 1941 to 51, is forthcoming from the University of British Columbia Press. So, take a little bow. There you go, good. And then we have Guy Aiken, somebody who's just beginning this whole research thing. We need these, you know, we can't all be old like me. You need young people doing this stuff. And Guy Aiken is a Ph.D. candidate in American Religions at the Religious Studies Department at the University of Virginia. His dissertation, Sowing Peace, Reaping War, is about the AFSC's humanitarian projects in Germany and Appalachia in the 1920s and 30s. And his talk is called Peace Without Justice. The 3rd person on our yeah, take a little bow, just wait. The 3rd person in our group is Immaculada Colomina Limonero. Did I get it right? Okay. She's is about connecting excellence. Marie Curie Fellow at the School of Humanities, History, Geography, and Arts at the Universidad Carlos, Madrid, Spain. She specializes in immigration and refugee scholarship with a focus on women and children, particularly, both as a researcher and a professor. And her dissertation focuses on the Spanish children refugees in the former Soviet Union. For 5 years, she's been a postdoctoral fellow at the Arizona State University and is currently leading a research project about North American international humanitarian relief for women and children through the Spanish Civil War. Okay, take a little bow. I'm delighted to listen to these people. I'm glad we're here. Thank you.
Thank you. As Emma said, my paper is called Peace Without Justice, but it's with an inflection at the end. Peace without justice. It's a question. So I'm more asking a question than making a definitive statement here. My thesis is this, as simply stated as I can put it. The neutrality that humanitarianism demands prevents, hamstrings, gets in the way of the work for justice that peace requires. In other words, if one is in the business of intervening in violent situations or politically fraught situations to save people's lives, one often cannot afford to then also speak truth to power. In January of 1922, as the AFSC was yielding control of the German feeding to the Germans themselves, the AFSC was in Germany feeding. In 1922, they had fed over 3 million children at that point, and there was a lull between the first phase of the feeding and the second phase of the feeding. And in this lull, the AFSC's Home Service Committee heard an appeal from one of its members on behalf of striking miners in West Virginia. The strikers and their families needed food and shelter. The coal companies had evicted many of them from their company-owned houses. They were now living in tents in the middle of winter. The Home Service Committee brought the matter before the general meeting of the AFSC, which then referred it warmly to the executive board. The leadership of the AFSC recognized that industrial conflict at home would severely test the organization's neutrality. A Red Cross official had written AFSC Executive Secretary Wilbur Thomas in February of 1922 that, quote, "It is our policy to leave the responsibility of relieving conditions due to unemployment where it rightfully belongs, namely with the state and local authorities." Near the end of June 1922, Thomas assured the president of the Red Cross that the AFSC sought to feed and clothe women and children only, with need alone determining whom the AFSC would help, and all this, quote, "without discussing any of the issues involved in the present controversy in the coal industry." The AFSC used its work in Germany to justify its intervention in West Virginia. It had staked its claim as a protector of innocent life in Germany and was now compelled by the force of its own logic to protect human life in its own country. Quote, "The same principle which guided us in carrying relief to German and Russian children," Thomas declared, "impels us to enter this new field. But this was a different kind of war in a different kind of field. AFSC workers in the Appalachian coal fields would be working in the very midst of a still raging war, albeit an industrial one rather than military one. And they would be face to face with the combatants on both sides. Here was a war at home," wrote the AFSC's chief field worker in West Virginia, another Jones, Luella Jones. No relation to Rufus Jones, I don't think. Quote, "While the two factions were fighting over the question of labor organizations, the families were in dire need. Could we go in as neutrals and give them help?" Just a little background on the industrial strife in West Virginia at this time. There was general post-World War I labor strife in the country at large in 1919. It spread to the coal fields late in that year. It simmered during the course of 1920 and then boiled over in May of 1921 when the largely non-unionized coal fields of West Virginia erupted in violence between strikers and deputies along the Kentucky border. Over the next few months, an untold number of men on each side were killed or wounded. Finally, hundreds of miners in the one unionized county in the state of West Virginia, Kanawha County, walked off the job in August of 1921 to stand in armed solidarity with their non-union brethren across county lines. Within days, a makeshift army of 8,000 men were under the command of miners, some in uniform, with combat experience in the Spanish-American and First World Wars. It was the largest civil insurrection in the United States since the Civil War. The governor of West Virginia asked President Harding for federal troops. Instead, Harding had battle planes drop leaflets ordering the miners to disperse. On August 31st, the miners joined in open combat with local and state law enforcement, and on September 2nd, planes dropped gas and shrapnel bombs on the miners. The first time American citizens had been bombed on their own soil by their fellow citizens. Now, Harding deployed federal troops. At this point, the miners willingly surrendered, thinking that federal troops, Uncle Sam, would protect their constitutional rights. But the troops soon left, and left the state to its own devices again. Then, the state's unionized mines announced that they had to cut wages to compete with the non-union mines. And the labor organization in West Virginia at the time, the United Mine Workers of America, orchestrated a statewide strike starting April 1st, 1922. Luella Jones arrived from the AFSC 3 months later. Luella Jones is a delight to read. Her letters and reports in the AFSC archives, which is, as you know, I'm sure is a treasure trove. But who she was is hard to know. The only documentary trace she appears to have left behind is the batch of letters and memos she wrote while on assignment with the AFSC in West Virginia. In 1922, all I can ascertain is that she was a middle-aged Quaker social worker from Iowa and a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Iowa City. But when she signed up with the AFSC, she was at that point teaching at George School, a private prep school outside Philadelphia. She sent her first field report to Philadelphia from Charleston, West Virginia on the 4th of July, 1922. You can tell very quickly that neutrality did not come easily to Luella Jones. Near the end of July, she wrote Philadelphia, "We are still neutral, but I must say that I am disgusted to see the way our government has failed to see the situation or to help toward a peaceful settlement." She clearly sympathized with one side in the battle, with the miners, and framed the conflict in their terms. She said, "It's a fight to see whether miners shall form unions, and the president, Harding, runs true to form in favor of the capitalists." Yet, the flowing of alcohol in the hills of coal country raised her prohibitionist hackles. Quote, "Moonshine is so common about us that people do not take the trouble to hide it from us or anyone." By the end of August 1922, she and the AFSC had set up 5 feeding centers in coal camps in southwestern West Virginia. In each of these centers, local coal miners' wives and daughters cooked the food. One of Jones's most helpful volunteers was the sister of a moonshiner. The woman's other brother was a federal prohibition officer. "Now, what is one to do?" Jones asked, throwing up her hands. On September 21st, she wrote that a judge had just ruled that any miners living in company housing were trespassing if they refused to work for the owner of the house, i.e., the company. Yet most of the companies in southern West Virginia insisted that their men sign what were called yellow dog contracts, which forbade them explicitly from joining the union. Many of the men found this unacceptable and preferred to risk eviction and life in a tent colony rather than desert the union. Jones found this die-hard loyalty to the union hard to fathom at first. But then, in mid-October, she stepped into a coal mine herself. Quote, "Today I accomplished my longing desire," direct quote, "longing desire of visiting a mine," she wrote Philadelphia. That morning, she and 4 other women had climbed inside an empty coal car and ridden up an incline of 1,100 feet to the mouth or portal of a tunnel so low they had to stoop to enter it, and stay stooped as they walked the 2,700 feet to the mine itself. They entered the mine where the men were working, and their guide showed them the whole operation of cutting the coal from the face of the mine and loading it into carts. Jones left the mine a changed woman. As she said, "I am very much subdued tonight as a consequence of what I have seen. I am sure the men deserve all that they get from mining. I am more than ever impressed with the benefits which the union has earned in getting safe conditions for the workers. I am more than usually impressed with the kindliness and the humanness of these men. I have hardly looked at the men in our camps. I can call very few of them by name, though the faces are familiar, but they have known me all summer. And now that I begin to look at them, I find I must take them into account as a member of the families. Nothing could have been more thoughtful and courteous than the treatment we had. I feel like weeping to think what a little pimple I am to be representing the Society of Friends. Jones had walked into the belly of a mountain and come out politically reborn. She now saw the miners. She was no longer neutral. As she wrote a local acquaintance the next day, I am all for the miners now. Taking sides exacted a price from Luella Jones. Near the end of October, just a couple weeks after she went into the coal mine, she wrote Philadelphia, I could hardly sleep last night and I've had a nervous headache today because of things. It was the emotional burden that had her feeling on the verge of, in her words, getting hysterical. Just before Thanksgiving, a minor preacher walked 20 miles to where she was staying to ask for food and clothes for his daughter who was crippled and had pneumonia. He said that both the Red Cross and the Salvation had turned them down the previous year, presumably because they were among the strikers. On December 5th, Jones visited a tuberculosis home with about a dozen children and a mother who was dying of consumption. Jones said that she had found a nice home for the baby of the family that past summer, but, quote, the selfish, indulgent things would not give him up. The mother had nursed the baby until Jones made her stop. Now, she said, he has something dreadful wrong with him. He coughed and strangled yesterday when I was there. She almost lost her composure and fled. She said, I wanted to sit down and squall for Ernest when I got out in God's sunshine again. Then on December 12th, 1922, she wrote Philadelphia, tomorrow I expect to do something which I think would take me a week to justify in your mind. She was going to state police headquarters to intercede on behalf of a moonshiner. The man, Mr. Bass, was a down-and-out miner who could not find work anywhere. Over the past 2 years, his daughter had died. After several weeks, the daughter's baby had died. And meanwhile, Mr. Bass's brother had died. To help pay for his brother's funeral, he borrowed some money. Now his creditors wanted to collect, and he took to making moonshine. Jones said that he set the mash in his own home for another man who cannot afford to run risks. Mr. Bass now sat in jail under a $1,000 bond. He was almost desperate, Jones said, and she knew that his only crime was to be a miner in West Virginia. She said, I wish we could transport him to a place where he could have a chance. If he is a crook, he is the squarest, most straight from the shoulder, straight in the eye one I've ever seen. Some of these days, I'm going to turn into a radical. Jones knew as she had overstepped, in spirit at least, the bounds of the AFSC's relief work in West Virginia. She wrote a friend at the AFSC a couple of days later that she was, quote, getting out of perspective, impatient and rabid. She thought a visit to Philadelphia will cool me off a bit. She also wrote Mr. Bass that day, a couple of days after saying she was going to go to state police. And she told him, I have to tell you that I did not get time to call at the office of the state police last Wednesday, as I told you I would. The reason is that I had several other pressing errands which took longer than I had expected. She assured him that she really was concerned. I know you are in a desperate situation. If there's anything at all I can do to help you out, I shall surely do it. But apparently interceding with the state police on his behalf was apparently no longer among the things that she was willing to do. Before traveling to Philadelphia for Christmas and New Year's, Jones visited that minor preacher who a few weeks before had walked 20 miles to her for food and clothes. And the little girl who was crippled and sick with pneumonia had wrapped her scrawny little arms around Jones's neck and said over and over, I love Miss Jones. This is my Miss Jones. Then she went to Philadelphia, and from her perspective, as well as the AFSC's leadership, the holiday in Philadelphia proved to be just what the doctor ordered. My equilibrium is restored, she wrote a friend, and the call of the work in West Virginia is taking better proportions in my mind. She realized that she was, quote, getting too one-sided to be a good representative of friends. Significantly, Jones apparently thought neutrality was inherently Quakerly and not simply a pragmatic posture necessary to deliver humanitarian aid. One way to read this is that, given Jones's partiality for the minor side, the AFSC Home Office retutored her in the relative merits of the owner-operators, capital's side. Jones could make this ideological retraining, if that's what it was, sound almost clinical. She said, "Nobody seemed alarmed. I guess they thought close supervision for a week or 10 days might cure me." She was to return to the field for 3 months, but this time with a minder. "I'm also to have a companion for a few weeks," she said. "That will make my own work easier and give me a chance to get wrong ideas out of my system before they do harm." Now, another more charitable way to read Jones's time in Philadelphia is that she was reminded of what was at stake. Nothing less than some people's lives. If Jones were to alienate the owners and operators of the coal mines, they would banish her from their towns and camps. And some of the miners and their wives and children might likely die of hunger or cold as a result. The harm her wrong ideas could inflict was not just on her own spirit, but also on the lives of other people, the very people she cared so much about. In other words, I wonder if Jones had discovered that humanitarianism and radicalism were incompatible. Relief work had put her in situations full of terrible need and raw injustice, yet she was constrained by the very nature of relief work from, in fact, doing anything at all to help. If the AFSC was allowed to feed and clothe the families of striking and union miners in these coal camps, it had to keep quiet. Even still, some locals were to remain convinced that the Quakers were socialists. Simply put, Jones could not be both a radical and a humanitarian at the same time. She had to choose. She returned to West Virginia in January of 1923, seemingly a model of humanitarian neutrality. She and her companions scrupulously avoided any appearance of favoring the strikers. They would not bring food and clothing into the tent colonies for fear of appearing to side with the miners. And in her final report of the AFSC's relief work in Kanawha County, she wrote, "It has been the policy of the Service Committee to observe a neutral attitude toward the political factions where help is being given. Our work is to serve humanity and to help bind up the wounds irrespective of issues at stake between those responsible for the conditions." She was breaking down physically. She had to retire from the field halfway through her second deployment near the end of February 1923, and she took up clerical work with the AFSC. And her whirlwind odyssey of radicalization and neutralization ended with one last letter to a nurse friend of hers outside Charleston, West Virginia. She said, "I hope Rhoda," that's the preacher's sick and crippled daughter who just before Christmas had hugged Jones's neck, "has been taken to the hospital by this time." And with that, Llewellyn Jones's singular documentary voice went silent. The noise of industrial conflict in West Virginia's coal fields, however, did not go silent. Despite the AFSC's avowed intention to inject a spirit of goodwill into the coal fields, Jones could not believe that the AFSC had, in her words, greatly softened the heart of any employer toward his union workers. Subsequent events bore this judgment out. A year after Jones and the AFSC left Kanawha County, in late 1924, the county operators demanded that the union accept a 38% cut on tonnage rates. The ensuing strike proved to be the last in the area until the New Deal guaranteed union recognition and the right to organize and strike in 1933. By September of 1925, all of the Kanawha strikers had either signed Yellow Dog contracts or, having lost their jobs to strikebreakers, moved away. The operators had not only broken the strike in Kanawha, they had broken the union in all of West Virginia. As Mary Harris, Mother Jones, the miner's angel, great labor activist, wrote in 1925, "There is never peace in West Virginia because there is never justice." And what I'd like to end with is just a question. Can you bring justice in one hand and relief in the other, or do you need both hands for either one? Thank you.